Chapter 2, To the Manor Born. The big question: how are the lives of serfs and lords different from one another? Right there in the illustration, we have a caption that says, privileged family in the Middle Ages. If you lived during the Middle Ages, your life allowed one of a few set paths. If you were the child of a king and a queen, or a lord and a lady, you lived a privileged life. You had enough food to eat and clothes to wear. You lived in a relatively nice house. You had servants, too. You may have been one of the few who learned to read and write. You even learned to ride a horse. If you were a boy, you learned to become a skilled swordsman. Privileged girls may have learned to embroider, to dance, and to play a musical instrument. Embroider means to sew things. Occasionally, girls, too, learn to read. As a privileged child, you likely grew up to become a king or a queen or a lord or a lady yourself. But most people in the Middle Ages were not privileged. In the early Middle Ages, nearly everyone in Europe worked on the land. Most farm workers were called serfs. Serfs grew the food and tended to the livestock or animals that fed the people. Some had more freedom than others and were called freemen. Serfs were at the bottom of the social order and had the least amount of power. Serfs usually spent their entire lives working on a landowner's or lord's estate. In return for the work they did, the lord allowed serfs to use some of the land to grow their own food. The lord lived in his castle or manor house. He owned all the land around his home and often the nearby towns and villages too. The lord also controlled the lives of most of the people who worked for him. So all of these illustrations, the caption tells us, are serfs who worked on the land throughout the year. So those are all illustrations of all the things that the serfs do on the land throughout the year. Serfs were not educated. They did not learn to read or write. If serfs wanted to travel to a nearby town, they needed permission from the lord. When serfs wanted to marry, the lord had the right to approve or disapprove of the match. When serfs had children, those children usually grew up to work as serfs for the same lord. In the Middle Ages, serfs worked on farmland that was divided into strips. The serfs spent about half of their time working for the lord. The rest of the time, they worked on the strips of land where their own crops were grown. Most serfs lived in small, simple houses in or near a village. Their houses were made from wood and mud. The roofs were thatched, meaning they were made from rushes or straw. They usually had just one room. Serfs slept on straw beds. Inside each house was a small fireplace for cooking. Smoke from the fire escaped through a hole in the roof. The lord increased his wealth in many different ways. In addition to working the farmland for the lord, serfs paid taxes to the lord in the form of money, crops, and livestock. Livestock would be like chicken, pigs, cows. Sometimes the lord ran a mill and even charged his serfs a fee to grind their grain into flour. If crops failed or illness struck, people during the Middle Ages struggled to survive. In times of hardship, the lord did not always come to the aid of his serfs. Even when food supplies were low, serfs were not allowed to hunt in the lord's forests. However, to avoid starving, people sometimes hunted illegally. This was called poaching, and serfs who were caught poaching were severely punished. Some farmers were freemen. Freemen were not under the same strict control of the lord. If a serf ran away from his home and managed to live for a year and a day in a town without being found, he could become a free man too. The Middle Ages was a violent time compared to how we live today. There were frequent wars and uprisings, including rebellions against the king by rival nobles. The need for armed protection shaped medieval society. Usually, high-ranking nobles swore their loyalty to the king and lords. Let me start that one over. Usually high-ranking nobles swore their loyalty to the king and lords. Usually high-ranking nobles swore their loyalty to the king, and lords swore their loyalty to higher-ranking nobles. Freemen and serfs had to be loyal to their lord. In exchange for their loyalty, the lord offered his protection. If the lord needed to raise an army, he would require freemen on his estates to serve as foot soldiers. You could see in that paragraph that I had to reread a couple of times for meaning because I wasn't understanding and I wasn't reading it correctly. So when you're reading on your own, you can use that strategy too. If you were a boy serf, from an early age, you work a full day. You wake up just before sunrise and go to sleep when it is dark. For breakfast, you have rye bread and water, or perhaps watery ale. Even before the sun is fully risen, and regardless of the weather, you begin your work on the land. In springtime, you are busy plowing and planting seeds. You assist in the delivery of baby lambs and calves. At midday, you walk home for a simple meal of rye bread and maybe a small piece of cheese. After lunch, you return to work, cutting logs for the Lord's fire. In the summer months, you tend to the crops you planted in the spring. You keep the hungry birds and insects away from the growing crops. Autumn, the time to harvest crops, is perhaps the busiest time of all. You help your mother and sisters pick fruits and berries, which they preserve and store for the winter. Using a simple tool, called a scythe, you harvest grain, crops such as wheat, oats, rye, and barley. You help store the grain. A good harvest makes everyone, especially the Lord, very happy. It means there is food to eat during the winter months. A good harvest is a time of celebration for all. Nevertheless, you have to get used to having less food to eat in the wintertime, and to feeling hungry and cold more often than not. At times, your parents find it difficult to make ends meet. Even if ice and snow lay upon the frozen earth, you still have jobs to do. You still have to feed and care for the livestock. You repair fences and barns. All the while, you continue to work on your family's strips of land. Each evening as the sun is setting, you return home quite exhausted. You end your day with a meal called pottage that your mother or sisters have prepared. Pottage is a vegetable stew with grain and a tiny piece of meat or fish with a grain and a tiny piece of meat or fish in it. After a good night's sleep, you will wake up and do it all again. All right, so I didn't do this before. I'm going to go back and look at the illustrations and read the captions. So this is a boy serf plowing fields. This is a boy serf chasing birds away from crops. Boy serf harvesting grain. And then a serf family eating a meal together. Medieval musings. In the Middle Ages, a kind of food was made from grain was used as a plate. What was it? Number 2, in the Middle Ages, people kept coins in clay pots. The pots were made from a type of clay called pig or pig. I'm not sure how to say that. See how it's in italics? That's because it's in a different language. That's why I don't know how to say it. Today, many children place coins in a special container, the name of which originates in the Middle Ages. What is the container called? Number 3, a popular board game that is still played today arrived in Europe from Persia in the 800s. What is the name of that game? Clue. Make sure you check your answer. Caption says, wealthy lords and ladies played games like this. Now I'm going to read you the letter quest. So every time you see a letter quest, there is going to be a letter that you are looking for in the illustration. If you look on page 23 of your text, of your workbook, that is where you are going to start writing the letters. So this is where you would write the letter for chapter 2. If you look on page 23, it has chapters 2 through 9. On that line above chapter 2, you would write the letter that you can find in the stained glass right there. It says stained glass windows adorned medieval churches. Most people in the Middle Ages could not read and write. Stained glass windows depicted stories from the Bible and helped to communicate Christian beliefs. Look closely at this stained glass window. A letter of the alphabet has been hidden for you to find. When you find it, record this letter on activity page 2.3, just like I was showing you. We're talking about. After you find all the letters in the letter quest activities, you will arrange them to spell a word related to the Middle Ages.